Salvation Army co-founder Catherine Booth said, if we are to better the future, we must disturb the present. This is the Disturbance podcast from Salvation Army Women's Ministries. Hi to mine, welcome to the Disturbance podcast. Those of you who are very clever might notice there's something a bit different about my guest today. Namely, he's a male. We are a women-centric podcast. We're a women's ministry, so it takes a very special and brave man to come on. And that special and brave man also happens to be my husband, Martin.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about family violence. And for many, this is still quite a taboo subject, something that's still really kept in the dark. And so thank you so much for agreeing to come on and speak out about your own experiences. Friday the 25th of November is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And as part of that, the Salvation Army is marking White Ribbon Day, which is specifically about men speaking out against violence towards women. So that's why we've got a man on the podcast, because it's about men speaking out. And so we're just going to be hearing some of Martin's stories today. So welcome, Martin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's just jump straight in.
Sure.
Tell me about your experiences growing up in the kind of family environment that you grew up in.
Yeah. I think I grew up in, I guess, what people would consider quite a privileged kind of background. I went to quite good schools as a youngster. My parents, my dad had a really good job, working in the civil service in the UK. So he was like a career kind of civil servant. My mum was a very sort of successful tailor and dressmaker. Right. So my sister was great. She also went to a really good school. But I think along the way, quite from early on, there was always an undercurrent that I couldn't quite put my finger on. As a child, I just felt that something wasn't quite right. From an early age, I was exposed to a lot of shouting, a lot of aggression, a lot of anger. My dad would lose his temper over really, really small things. And there was the sort of the verbal and emotional aggression, and there was a lot of physical aggression. And I think as a child, I assumed that was relatively normal behavior. That's what parents did. My mum didn't do it. My mum was very caring and sensitive and kind, and very loving, but my dad was very much the other end of that spectrum. And I think I just grew up assuming that that's how dads operated. That's how fathers operated. If they got angry about something, they were physical as well as verbal. So I grew up with a lot of sort of physical aggression right from early on. The slightest thing would be sort of punished, and it felt, even to me at an early age, the punishment was sort of extreme or just seemed out of proportion to the things I'd sort of done wrong or perceived had done wrong by my dad. So it was quite jarring, like emotionally, it was very upsetting, but I think I also felt really confused. I think that was the biggest thing, is going along thinking, is this normal behavior? Is this what other children experience? Is this what other families are like? Is this how other parents behave? And it was only as I got on as an older child that I began to sort of I guess see how serious it actually was.
I guess one of the things that, because we don't comfortably talk about family violence, and it is an uncomfortable topic, can you give me a couple of examples that you feel okay sharing about? You said there was physical punishment, and I guess a question a lot of people have was, well, what's the difference between, say, being aggressive and being abusively aggressive, or being angry and being abusively angry? Can you give me a couple of examples that didn't feel right to you even as a child?
I think I said earlier, kind of, it seemed like very small things would set my dad off. And, and often it was, sort of poor behavior at school, but it was mostly things like, I got my uniform dirty. I played football at school, and like you do as a kid, and you get your uniform dirty, and everyone does. But I got home, and it seemed like a really big deal. My dad would get really, really angry about it, and or if I scuffed my shoes too badly, that was, it seemed out of proportion, the response. My dad would say things like, you'll only be a failure. You won't be as successful as your sister. You won't amount to anything. So even at a young age, they were quite cutting words. And I felt those, even though they weren't physical in a sense, emotionally, they were very cutting. But there were, acts of aggression and violence. So I don't really remember the context, but I did something. And I do remember it being fairly innocuous. And my dad really, really getting angry, like yelling. He could yell really loudly because he used to be in the military. So he was a very authoritarian figure, physically quite imposing. I remember him screaming at me one day and literally grabbing hold of me and throwing me out the front door of the house, unlocking it behind me and saying, "You're going to stay out there all night." And I remember my mum particularly, like, being really upset and crying and trying to placate my dad and trying to sort of negotiate with him to let me back in. And it was actually really...
And you were very little at that stage.
Yeah, I was probably... I couldn't have been more than maybe 7 or 8. And I do recall it being terrifying because it was night, it was dark, even though I was only on the doorstep. And I do remember banging on the door. And then probably another one that sort of stands out from kind of roughly around the same age, maybe slightly older, was my dad throwing me down a flight of stairs at home. Just things like that really stick out in my mind. This kind of move from 0 to 100 miles an hour is how I put it. And going from being mildly upset to extreme rage and violence in a heartbeat. So,
did you witness violence towards your mum?
There were times when I did see it. I think a lot more happened behind closed doors, and by that, my dad dragging my mum into a bedroom or another room and closing the door, and then hearing the noise, hearing the violence. And you knew something was going on. Even as a child, you recognize that someone's getting hurt. And there were a few times when, my dad would like grab my mum really aggressively and throw her across the room, or he would slap her, but he tended to do a lot of it behind closed doors. I do remember, even as a child, sort of waking up in the middle of the night and hearing my mum yelling and screaming and being really upset, and just holding myself tight in my in my bedclothes and in my bed, and just putting my pillow over my head and just hoping that it would stop. Because I was still young, so was my sister, and we didn't know what to do. I don't think there could have been anything we could have done. My dad was a very physically imposing man. Like I said, he used to be in the Royal Marines, and so to go up against him was just not conceivable. But so whilst I did see a relative level of violence against my mum with my own eyes, I heard a lot more and perceived a lot more that was going on behind closed doors. And that was almost an everyday occurrence.
It's interesting because in some of my readings, I've read that, research shows that children don't need to witness violence to be traumatized by it. They just need to be exposed to it in some ways. When we talk about violence, we often talk about the physical. You also mentioned the sort of verbal abuse. And there are, other forms of violence as well, that kind of controlling behavior. Obviously, I do know your story, so I know that, you've also talked about there being, financial, fraudulent behavior from your father. So there's like financial abuse as well. It extends sort of way beyond the physical. What is the physical violence the most traumatic, or is it all together? It's the whole picture.
I don't know. I think at different times in my life, I think I've perceived or felt more the effects of looking back on the physical violence. Like you alluded to, my dad was financially fairly dodgy in some of his practices, which I won't go into, but some things that really sort of, when he ended up leaving my mum eventually, sort of financially put my mum in strife for a long time afterwards, and she tried to raise my sister and I. So that was very difficult. But again, at the time, I didn't really see that quite as much. Interestingly, I think now looking back further down the line in my life and reflecting a lot more, I think actually it's weird. The physical stuff hurt, but it hurt for a short time. But I think the things that I've tried to get healing in and have tried to process and have had counselling and prayer is very much around the emotional aspect. I think for me, that's been the thing that stayed with me the longest. And even today, at age 48, there are still sometimes I hear a certain word or a phrase and I find it quite triggering, and it takes me back to that time as a child. And I think my sister too, she would say the same. She wasn't, able to avoid all this stuff either. But I think certainly for me, looking back, I do think the emotional wounds have lasted a lot longer. The physical scars healed. I know people say that, and I'm not watering that down or demeaning it. But for me personally, on my journey, the verbal and the emotional stuff has been the stuff that's been really deep-seated and has caused a lot of hurt.
So as you got older in your teenage years, or as you start to be able to process these things sort of cognitively, how did it affect you in your development?
I mean, I don't think I developed very well, to be really honest. I mean, I was a fairly awkward kid and fairly awkward teenager. I was quite shy. Probably comes as a shock to some people who know me now, but I was very shy. I didn't really say a lot. The other paradigm at work was I was being bullied at home, physical abuse and emotional abuse and verbal abuse. And I was a really small kid at school, so I was being physically bullied at school. So I didn't have a safe place. I hated going to school. And I hated all the time I was there because I was bullied and picked on all the time because I was really shy. Then I would get home and it would carry on at home. And so I didn't feel like I had a place to escape to. So from, pretty much sort of, I think, six or seven onwards, when I first really began to frame a bit more of what was going on, right up until I left school at 18, school was just a nightmare for me. All through those schools, I was bullied in every school I went to, and I was bullied at home. I don't think I related well to people. I was really shut down. I was really shy. I wouldn't talk to people. A real saving grace was I started going to a youth group at a local church when I was sort of 15. I went because I was told there were girls there, so which was really cool. But it was nice. There was a mixed group. There was males and females. We had a really large group of young people, and people really valued me, and people really saw me for who I was. But also, in part of that, they didn't. Even though I was quite broken, I look back now and I was very hurt and traumatized and broken, and through no fault of my own, but also sometimes my own fault, I would make some bad choices or actually just not treat people very well. And it's just because I didn't really know how to relate to people. I had quite a emotionally sort of stunted development, I think. And so I just didn't know how to talk to people, relate to people, not just my peers, people in the youth group, girls and boys. And so people who treated me kindly and treated me with respect and were really open and honest with me, I found very loving and caring. And I found that quite jarring because I was hearing at home, I got two people who love me, and only one of them showed me that, which is my mum. My dad didn't. And I was going to a youth group where people were saying the same thing, but they actually sort of lived it out. And as part of that, they didn't take my nonsense. They started to challenge me on some of those ways in which I was behaving. And it was out of trauma and fear, but I didn't treat people with respect. I didn't treat people very nicely. I began to develop a temper, very much like my dad, where I'd go from 0 to 100. I didn't pick fights, but I was known as being really aggressive. And I had some really strong male mentors in that group, the youth leaders who, I remember one of them very clearly took me aside one day and said, look, we love you. You're a great person, but we don't like the behavior that you bring sometimes. And you've got to change that. And I remember feeling really ashamed by that and really upset. But, people kept inviting me things. People, I'd go around to people's houses in the summer, and we'd hang out and after school. And some of those people I'm still friends with now, 30 years later, 35 years later, which is amazing. And I'm really thankful. But they were honest in how they loved me. They were honest in terms of making me accountable. And I think for me, it took a long time to see that was a good thing. And really between, I think, the ages of 14 to 18 are hard anyway, at school or just as a teenager. And they were incredibly hard for me because I was so unsure of myself. I didn't feel like I had a place anywhere. And suddenly I went along to this place where I did feel like I could belong. But with it came challenges about who I was and who I wasn't. And so for me, that was a whole melting pot of trying to work that out. But certainly in terms of my development, I would say that, probably it took me, I'll be honest, when I look back at what I was like when I was 18, I was probably only about 11-year-old in terms of my emotions because of how shut down I'd been over the previous years. So developmentally, it was a really hard time. Yeah.
It's a really interesting point that you sort of bring up, because, what we're raised with in our own family is our normal. And so literally we don't know any different until someone shows us something different. And like you said, that is very jarring. And what can, if you've only experienced love in a really rejecting way, from a father figure, then when someone shows you something different, you can actually automatically reject that. And how did you start to break that cycle in your own life? How did you not repeat your the behavior that you'd grown up with?
I think a couple of things. One was my dad leaving, which physically removed that problem, and obviously that helped. But then, I was trying to support my mum through that time afterwards, although it was for her, it was also, like I said, a very difficult financial time. I think, so for me, I was almost then having to be the father figure in the house, and I didn't know how to do that, and I didn't really know how to be a teenager. One of the things, like I said, I started going to this youth group, and I do remember we used to go to these week-long camps in the summer, and it was great. You'd have 150 teenagers, and it was brilliant, and it was just fun, and it was really awesome, and people got on really well, and people were really close, and again, like I say, people I'm friends with to this day. But I remember, sort of when you do these camps, there's workshops and lots of different things, and one of them was about relationships and divorce and parents. And one of my friends suggested I went, and I thought, I can't think of anything worse. But I ended up going, and there was a guy speaking there called Archie Coates, who's a vicar now. And he was speaking about this, and his parents had, after many years of marriage, 40-something years, had suddenly divorced out of the blue. And as an adult, he was trying to process that. And he said it was really shocking for him. And I remember listening to him and thinking, whilst there wasn't the violent or emotional aspects, the pain I could sense he was feeling really resonated with me about how I was feeling, and that uncertainty of knowing who you are and just not feeling safe. And I remember talking to him afterwards. I was, like I said, I was a really shy kid, but I wanted to talk to him, and I said, I really, it was amazing what you shared. And I remember him looking at me saying, you're going through that, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And we talked for quite a long time. I don't totally recall what he said, but, it was very affirming, encouraging. And then right at the end, he ended the conversation by saying, that's not your fault, right? All that stuff that's happened, that's not your fault. And I said, well, I've been coming to this youth group, and I know at times I've not been very nice, and I haven't treated people very well. And, and I get that. And he said, sure, but that's coming from your pain. That's coming from your trauma, and that's not you, and that's not your fault. And I remember saying this to me several times over, and I was really sort of shut down as a kid. Like, I just did not display emotion. And I just remember bursting into tears and thinking, is that actually true? Is it actually not my fault? And I think for me, that was the catalyst. That was the start of a very long journey that's still ongoing around, it wasn't my fault. And actually I could be well again. I could be healed again. I could move on in life, and at some point in the future be better. And I think that was a challenge for me to start with this really close group of friends I now had at this youth group, to start treating them better. And I absolutely didn't get it right. And it took a long time, but that was a very seminal conversation for me. And I often still think of that.
So how did your healing actually start? We've talked a lot about sort of, I guess, the trauma. How did you sort of start to turn around and find healing through all of that?
I found that a lot of it started by when I was part of this youth group a couple of years after leaving school. So I left school like no qualifications. I just, the stress that I was experiencing as a teenager and being at home, I just, I'd failed in all my exams. I didn't do well. So I had a couple of years when I was unemployed straight after leaving school, and course, that didn't really do much for my self-esteem. It made me feel worse. But as part of that, I started volunteering at the youth group and just beginning to do things for other people. And I think volunteering or serving or just doing something for someone else gives you another focus and gets your focus off yourself. And I think for me, I found a lot of healing in that and being able to do things for other people and just being present around great people who are really kind and generous.
So you talked about sort of being around loving people at youth group, and that is, so often the journey for so many people. How did you actually become a Christian, and did that change the course of sort of the way the course of your life?
The more I saw of what I was doing and the people I was around and the difference that those people were making to others around them in their jobs and schools and hobbies, I thought, there's something about this that's true. I can see it in people. And I think when people are authentic, they don't need to necessarily talk about it. It shows. And for me, I thought, if there's something in this, then I need to do it justice and I need to give it time. And so probably about 2 years after I got confirmed, just quietly one day, I was like, if this is real, this is you, God, then I'm going to be all in. And I think I wouldn't say there was like a groundbreaking moment that happened at the time, but I think for me, I'd begun to come to a place where people were sort of saying, like, some of how you are, it feels like, kind of how you are is maybe some things that we would say might be linked to depression or kind of your emotional well-being. And of course, being a guy, I was like, oh, we don't really talk about things like that. But equally, I was with really good male leaders who are actually, look, it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's okay. We all struggle. We all have these different things. So I think I wouldn't say I was labeled as such, but as I talked to other people who'd been through similar things, it resonated with me. I'm like, oh, actually, my highs were very high, but my lows were really low and took a long time for me to come out of. And partly that was all the brokenness that happened before and the physical and emotional abuse. But I think as I started to press more into God, I began to see who God really was and what he wanted for me and how he wanted me not to just be free, but to be healed and to be free. And that was a big thing. I was like, I think God brings freedom, which seemed a really cool deal compared to what I was experiencing. I wanted to be free of all of that. But I think it was the healing aspect as well that I thought, actually, I owe it to myself to start that journey. And it was a couple of years, probably after my confirmation again, I think I was at a camp somewhere. Someone else was talking. It was a guy. I wish I could remember who it was. And they said, people talk, guys, we sweep stuff under the carpet, our feelings and how we are. And he said, that's fine. But if you keep sweeping it under the carpet, guess what? After a while, the bulge under the carpet gets really big and you end up tripping over it. And everything comes out and you end up hurting yourself. And it was a cartoon-like analogy, but I remember it really struck me as going, and someone said at the time, because we were all like young, sort of single men in our, late teens, early 20s. And this, I wish I could remember who it was, but I remember him saying, you got to do it for yourself and you got to do it for your future wife and children. And I just thought, that's crazy. I'm nowhere near that. But he said, but trust me, if you don't start it now.
I'm only 35.
Yeah. If you don't start it now, you don't want to risk it coming back later and having more of an impact. And I remember thinking, wow, feels like that's going to be a really long journey. But also something in that struck a chord and was like, no, if you're going to do something, and I'm sure you'll know, I'm very much 100% or nothing person. If I'm really in something, I'll give it my all. And I felt like I was saying, that's part of your personality and I want to use that. And I want you to be fully in on this. So I think I started to, I took some practical steps. I went I started to read some kind of sort of really recommended books around sort of mental health and healing and kind of healing prayer. And I did a couple of healing prayer workshops, which are residential. I remember distinctly going on one in my early 20s, and there was me and one other male on this healing prayer school, and everyone else there was women, which was amazing. And they were very much more open about their feelings and pains and hurts. And as a guy, I felt quite awkward at the start of the week going there, but by the end, I felt so encouraged. I came away having two really extreme feelings. One, of feeling really happy and healed about a lot of stuff, and it started a big journey. But sad that there were not more guys there, because I thought this is really powerful. And so probably for the next 2 or 3 years after that, I badgered my male friend saying, we've got to be better about this. We've got to be more open about, violence or depression or emotional abuse or loneliness. And loneliness is a big one in guys, especially because we don't talk about that. And I remember sharing just randomly one day, probably in my early to mid-20s, with a guy I didn't know that well who went to my church. And he said to me, "How are you doing?" And I did the usual, I'm fine. He said, "No, how are you?" And we didn't really hang out in the same circles. And I remember just saying, randomly, just coming out and saying to him, "I actually feel really lonely at the moment. I'm actually going through a lot of hard things, and I got good people around me, but in the midst of that, I still feel the sense of loneliness." And I remember he gave me this look like, I really wished I hadn't answered that question. But interestingly, he paused and didn't say anything for a little while. And he leaned into me and he said, "I feel like that every day." And from that moment, we had that kind of connection. And he said, "I almost feel like I've been waiting for someone to validate that and give me permission to share that too."
Wow.
So I certainly think beginning to understand that I was having these depressive episodes and beginning to understand that that was linked to my loneliness, and all of that harkens back to that sort of physical and emotional abuse, and also that journey pressing into God and beginning to see that I need to do more of that to bring about healing, to sort those things, was my responsibility. So I think that's how that started to all coalesce and come together. So
that's one of the things that I know White Ribbon Day has been talking a lot about, is what they call healthy masculinity. And that's kind of what you've been really describing, is that kind of ability to be vulnerable is really huge, and that guys aren't really socialized in our culture to be able to do that. But I think that would go a long way towards building healthier relationships if guys did have permission to actually be able to be vulnerable.
Definitely.
So then, of course, you did, before we met, you'd been to, heck of a lot of counselling and done a lot of work on yourself. And then second best thing that ever happened to you after becoming a Christian, you met me.
Absolutely.
For myself, I'll just talk about sort of generally relationships and mutuality in relationships for a minute. This kind of concept of submit to each other in Christ, which Ephesians talks about, often has been distorted to wives, submit to your husbands, without the sort of mutuality being brought in, which is the greater theme of that passage. And I know for me, even though when we met, I was, very much believed in the equality of women in both, roles and status. And, that's something I'm really grateful to the Salvation Army for, and that belief. But I'd grown up in a church environment, almost polar opposite from you, a very conservative church environment that really did emphasize the submission of women. So when we got married, my thing was more that I think I held some subconscious ideas about it being my role to kind of keep everything happy and make you happy. And the big learning curve that I've had in marriage, since we've been married for 12 years, has been to find my voice. And the reason why I bring this up is because, research will tell you that the reason why violence happens from men to women is this kind of underlying belief that as a male, you're more important than a woman, and that it's a woman's job to please you. And that sometimes, unfortunately, has actually been perpetuated by church culture that says, yes, it's a woman's job to submit, without bringing in this kind of mutuality. So I really had to learn that, to find my voice, and that was healthier for our relationship than to just keep quiet all the time. For you, you did an amazing amount of work on yourself before we ever met, and you know, I really admire you, the person that you become from, you know, where you came from. But what did you go through? Like, how did you break the cycle and not repeat the behaviors that you'd seen? Because we so often, I think in a marriage relationship, you really sort of almost go back to your primal self sometimes and revert to your sort of default.
My dad grew up in an environment where men were right and they kind of did what they wanted to a degree, and you couldn't convince them they were wrong, and they were very stubborn. And I'm very aware that I grew up with a lot of those traits too, and at times still demonstrate those things, which isn't healthy. But I didn't want to carry that on, and I had to make a conscious decision. Sometimes I still have to do that even now, to say, I'm not going to behave that way. I'm not going to act that way, because it's not right. You know, I look back to kind of how my mum is now, who's been through, you know, a huge amount of difficulty in her life, was very broken. But then after my dad left, she sort of got back on her own 2 feet, and she did an amazing job of continuing to raise my sister and I. And I wouldn't be half the person I am today without her. And she's really strong. Sure, she has a lot of brokenness, but she's an incredibly strong woman, and I have huge admiration for her. So for me, that was a shining example. And then alongside actually very strong female leaders in other things that I've experienced, and thinking, why would I want to treat someone like that? I think it was making a choice, and it has been making a choice ever since. And sometimes I don't always get that right, but I think it's reminding myself of the things that my mother experienced, and thinking, why would I want another woman or child, you know, especially to go through like what I did and what my sister did and what my mum did. So quite often, certain circumstances or events I've been present around or near to, or I've intervened, has really brought flashbacks for me around some of the things that I experienced. And so it makes me want to help other people be well, but also for myself know that that's still an ongoing journey. You know, it has been for a long time, and it will continue to, I'm sure. And God's not finished with me yet. And but I know that definitely, you know, even as a guy in our marriage, I haven't always got that right, as you know. But I think it's kind of having confidence in God that He hasn't finished. He continues to do that good work in you, or carry it forward to completion. I was reminded of that verse even the other day, and it's like, God still hasn't finished with me, and it'll always be evolving and continuing. But I think it's just being open to healing and being open to change. And just even recently, you know, it's just praying each morning, actually give me humility, show me what I should be doing, but actually also what I shouldn't be doing. So I think for me more recently, that's been, I guess, my prayer around that stuff.
Really cool. Yeah. So the 25th being White Ribbon Day is about men speaking out against violence. Why do you think it is important for men particularly to speak out?
I think it's probably a number of reasons. I think there's some what would be considered inoffensive or jokey or lads kind of talk or behavior that's quite normalized, which actually shouldn't be normalized, and actually isn't appropriate, and actually isn't acceptable. And I think that happens across a wide sector of society. It can be in business, it can be a lot in sport, you know, and I play a lot of sport, and I've seen some of that. And I've called other guys out on it. You know, spent a lot of time in changing rooms with guys who have done sports, and some of the stuff in there is like, oof. And it's sort of normalized, and it's like, oh, it's just what's said in the changing room stays in the changing room. And I've had conversations with teammates who've gone, I really don't like that. You know, we decided we're actually going to speak up against that, because actually most people don't agree with it. So I think there's the normalcy of it around society that isn't healthy. And I think for men to call out other men and to say, you know what, that's not acceptable. You can't behave that way. So there's the accountability, but also the opportunity to say, you can be free of that stuff. It's not just that's not right and you shouldn't do it. Absolutely. Of course, that's absolutely it. But for me, it's the opportunity to say, I dare you to do better. You can be better than that. Whatever you've had in the past or even now doesn't have to stay that way. And I think for a lot of guys, for me, often at times if I'm angry or upset about something, it's because I'm feeling fearful. It's because I'm feeling insecure. It's because I'm feeling lonely or you know, whatever it is. You know, someone wiser than me said a few years ago, when guys say they're fine, that's not actually a word, it's an acronym. So fine is they're actually feeling fearful, insecure, neurotic, or emotional. And I joke, but I feel there's a large degree of truth in it, but certainly around violence and the normalcy of aggression and misogyny that we see all around us. I mean, especially on social media and the internet at the moment, it does take guys to call out other guys on it and say, we shouldn't be doing that. It's not healthy for anyone, certainly not, you know, females, but it's not healthy for any of us in society. And also use that as a platform to say, actually, are you okay? Are you doing all right? What's actually really going on there? Because most guys I've met who behave that way, and I've worked with some real extremes of people who propagated this level of sort of violence, deep down, fundamentally, 99% of them are broken or insecure or have trauma.
Yeah.
And yes, everyone has personal responsibility, but I've begun to see a lot more of there's fundamentally things at play that they'd rather suppress and bury, and they don't want to, but it comes out in this unhealthy behavior of misogyny or violence or threats or words. But actually, deep down, that is the issue, but it's what's underlying that powers it. And I think for guys, they find that difficult to be upfront about it. They don't want their worst fears realized, which is for someone to find out who they really are.
And I think that's one of the things that is a huge part of the conversation, is that we've been sold this lie that masculinity or to be macho or whatever, to let go of that is kind of like to make men less. But in fact, to let go of that, it allows men to be authentically themselves.
Yeah, I still think that there's a little bit of work to do around society for guys to say you can be masculine, but you can also be totally in touch with how you're feeling and be open about it.
One of the things I've been thinking about, because I often think about it as we've been talking, is how in the Jewish culture, when Jesus was around, that the concept of salvation meant not just rescued or rescuing, but healing. You know, and that's certainly been my experience, and what you've described is that it isn't just that moment of salvation, it's the ongoing healing that knowing Christ brings, and the way he allows us to become more fully ourselves, our true selves, not the false selves that we often feel we need to front with. And that just leads to healthier relationships with each other. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for speaking on behalf of men. No, you can't speak on behalf of all men, but thank you so much for being here and daring to come on to the Disturbance podcast. I know it's not easy to tell these stories. It's still something we don't really talk very openly about in our culture, and perhaps even more so in the church, and therefore it can be very easy to think that it's something that just happens sort of so-called out there. But I think it's really important, and we've been talking about this recently, that to remember that God loves us as people more than he loves us keeping rules. And often when you start talking about how do you stop, how do you, if you are in a situation of family violence or abuse within your marriage, how can you get out of it? How can you leave? And, often we jump to saying things like God hates divorce. And I think that really misrepresents God, because, in Malachi, where that verse is, God's talking in the out of compassion for women, because he's saying, don't be loyal to your wife. And women couldn't even get divorced, only men could do it, and women were left destitute. So God was speaking out of compassion, and he's always favored the powerless and has always cared for people that are suffering. And that is as true today as it ever has been. So when we have these conversations, I think it's really important to remember that, if you are in a situation of abuse yourself, that God wants the best for you. And he's there to save you and heal you, not to harm you. If you would like some help with family violence, please talk to a trusted person. If you're not ready to talk to anyone about it yet, you can actually go to the homepage of the Salvation Army website, www.salvationarmy.org.nz. scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the Shielded Site logo. That is a pop-up that you can click on, and it will give you some really good, solid advice written in partnership with Women's Refuge about what you can do, and it will not show up in your browser history, so it's completely safe. Thanks so much for sharing your story, Martin. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for being here.
You're welcome.